The store, I know there'll be others be coming in, and we'll let them come in as they so see fit. But in the meantime, my name is Bernie Foster. I publish the Skanner newspaper, and the reason I'm a little up and down here, as we all go through this face masking period about 4 months ago, I had COBRA, so I got well. I'm really recuperating. So I lost some of my speech, but I'm still trying. So and I lost some of my voice. So I'm taking a little voice therapy, and I'm getting back on my feet. But as we all know, at least I came back, and I didn't lose my sense of smell nor food. But I did lose a little voice and so forth. So, but I'm trying. So I'm keep going. But Vanport goes on. So Vo has given the studio, and so with that, I'll just like to start by saying this is probably our annual Vanport flood. We haven't did it in about 2 years because of the COBRA. So I'm happy to have that. But on the good part, I don't know if you know this or not. You remember Lee Moore? For those of you who don't remember Lee Moore was the guy in the last 2 or 3 years that had the red vest on that spoke. And by the way, as we all get a little older, he passed away about 4 months ago. So he was a Vanport survivor. And so that really made me sort of think about speeding the process up and making sure that people, we have a recording history of Vanport. We don't want it to go away.
Initially what happened is that my grandfather moved here. He was a barber. And then my aunt and my mother moved here. My aunt was a seamstress and my mother worked in the shipyard as a welder. She was kind of a Rosie the Riveter. She used to kid as we got older that she essentially was doing work that she couldn't get as an adult. But because of the wartime, it was like anybody who could breathe could go to work. And what was supposed to happen was that after the war, women were supposed to return home and do their wifely duties. And a lot of them did not, and my mother was one of those. And so my grandfather would cut hair in the living room. My aunt would sew and make clothes in one of the bedrooms. And so there was really kind of an extended nuclear family, all under one roof in government housing. The way the houses were built, and they actually called them shotgun shacks. Essentially what that meant is that you could stand at the front door and look all the way to the back door. And these houses were side by side, and you could have, 5 or 6 families living in one complex. And even with my parents, you had 5 adults and 2 children living essentially in a 2-bedroom house. And so trying to determine who was the rightful resident and things like that. Very similar to a lot of immigrant families today. What I remember, because I was very young, was essentially sleeping on the floors of Peninsula Grade School because we essentially lost our home, everything but a photo album. My mother was smart enough to grab that. Surprisingly enough, stayed in government daycare. We lived in a place called Giles Lake, which was a housing development that was set up for wartime families. over on St. Helens Road that was torn down, and then we moved to University Park in North Portland. And remember living in a government or staying in a government daycare center while my mother continued to work. And then in 1951, my parents, who had saved quite extensively doing the house, built a house on North Willis Boulevard out in St. John's. And I remember that was a big event, moving in and having crosses burned on our front yard and being told that we needed to go back where we came from. And so that's probably the most significant experience that I've seen. Vanport was split into two halves. One was predominantly Afro-American, essentially people from the South, and the other half was white, essentially people from the South. And so after the flood, it was very difficult to move into Portland because Vanport was created to keep those people, black and white, out of the city. And so many Afro-Americans left. Some went north to Seattle area, and others went back, returned home. And for those who stayed in the Oregon area, the Albina area was the most predominant place for Afro-Americans. And it wasn't until the fair housing laws were passed in the early 50s that blacks started moving throughout the city. But still, the majority of Afro-Americans stayed in the Albina area. I know that my parents, even with building the home in North Willis, could not buy the house or the land because of restrictions. And so the property was bought by a friend of my mother's who was Jewish, who bought it and then quick deeded it back to her. You know, when there was a major trauma, people kind of came together, but as soon as that trauma began to diminish, the signs of racism set in again. Well, I think that from what I recall, and I remember I'm very young, matter of fact, I even question if these are truly my memories or somebody else. And my mother used to ask me, she said, how can you remember that stuff if you were so young? I also know that thereafter, anybody who had survived the Vanport flood, there was a lot of conversation. We used to have just kind of large groups of people who would come over to the house after church. And there were stories that were being told, which is a mode of communication within the Afro-American community, which is verbal stories. As children, we were not asked to leave the room. We would sit around and listen to the adults talk. But what I heard and what I remember is that there were some warnings, but nobody believed that it was going to happen. I'm amazed that for essentially a town of 40,000 people, this is Oregon's second largest city, that was built essentially in 6, 7, 8 years and gone in one day, that it is the precursor to Portland State University, Vanport College. It's the precursor to Kaiser Hospital. It was Vanport Hospital. A lot of the Afro-American professionals that have offsprings that live in the city got their beginning in Vanport. First teacher of Afro-American, law enforcement, and the like started in Vanport. And even with the white community, it's something that is not stored. When you mention Vanport, people don't know what you're talking about if they weren't around then. So I think it's sad.
I was born in Holdenville, Oklahoma in 1927. When I arrived in Vanport, I was 16. The first thing I remember when I got off the train after about 3 days and 2 nights was that it was raining. And my uncle met us at the depot, train depot, and took us to Vanport, and I saw those big buildings, and I wasn't impressed because I had been used to having my own yard. There were about 16 different apartments in one building. And I remember they had recreation centers, which was good. They had wash houses where they had automatic washing machines, which we never had before we came out here. I attended one of the Baptist churches, and I have a picture of the congregation that they took back then, but that was before I came. And I started playing music for the church. My mother had a steady job. She worked swing shift at the shipyard, and she was very happy. In Tulsa, she did mostly domestic work. When we were growing up, it paid like $1 an hour. $1 a day. And it was hard work, you know. And after she got out here, and she was a sweeper too at the shipyard, but then when the shipyard ended, she did domestic work here, and it was so much easier and just better for her. Well, that was a Sunday morning. I was, that the flood came. That morning when we got up, there was a paper pushed up under the door. We lived upstairs. And it said that don't worry about the dike. The dike, if it breaks, just go upstairs. But about 2 or 3 hours after I left church, I heard this noise, and they were saying the dike has broken. So I went and got on somebody's truck, and I wanted to see how the water was coming in and where it was coming in. So we went down so far, and it was just rolling in. And so I came back and got my sons out with a neighbor, and my mother said she was going to stay upstairs. I heard that the buildings were moving, and then I just felt like, oh, my mother's out there and she's upstairs. But it so happened that she did get out. I learned that she got out after a few hours. Well, finally, after the water got really low, you know, evaporated out of the apartments, we went by there, but you know, it was just a tore-up mess. But we did find our apartment. I did find my photograph book. It was up on a shelf that the water didn't get to. This photograph book is about 67, well, since 1948, before 1948. I bought it when I lived in Vanport, so I could start taking pictures of the children and family members, especially the children. But as far as other things, there was nothing. They had probably been washed away. Nobody really offered any place that we could go, you know, in an emergency. And, you know, people had to move someplace. They had to find a place to live. We chose Vancouver because there were a lot of people that we knew in Vanport who were coming to Vancouver. And I've always liked it here because it used to be a small town, but you know, now it's grown a lot, and I like it here. I've always liked it.
We were in Ann Arbor, and my grandfather was there, and for some reason, I knew he was there to meet Dr. Clifford Keene, who was the physician in charge of healthcare at Kaiser Fraser. And my father was recommending to my grandfather that Clifford Keene come to California and assume general manager responsibility for Kaiser Hospitals and Health Plan. The dining room was lit in a dramatic fashion. People had coats and ties on for dinner. The conversation as a young 6-year-old, was totally over my head. Clearly, I was there to listen and not speak. And in any event, I remember that I was very aware that instead of sitting at a dining room table listening to the adults talk, the Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca show was on television. And one of the sponsors of that show was Kaiser Fraser. And I knew there were going to be advertisements that featured the Kaiser car. And I wanted to go down and see the advertisement. I did not want to sit there and listen to Henry J. talk about whatever with my father. And I asked permission to leave. And I didn't get an answer that I remember, so I just got up and left. And later I got a spanking for that. So that was my first exposure to Henry J. And why is that a memory? Because it made an impression on me that something important was happening here that in some odd way I was a part of. I recall my father's pride in the productivity of the shipyards and my grandfather's pride in his work. I hear stories about the competition between the Richmond and the Kaiser yards. What I never heard in any dining room discussions was anything about Vanport. I did not hear about the progressive, for example, social policy of integrated daycare or integrated schools or integrated shopping centers, when the absolute prerequisite of the war effort was established. It pushed all other biases and prejudices aside, just pushed them out of the way. My grandfather and my father took advantage of that and said, we are not going to be held back by barriers of political correctness, cultural resistance, bureaucratic obstruction. And they certainly ran into those things. They could get away with just saying, we have to do this, and did it to the best of their ability. That doesn't always mean they had the civic machinery under their control. That doesn't mean they always had the budget with which to do as much more than just the bare minimum than they might have otherwise liked to do. What they didn't do is stand on a soapbox and beat their chest and say, look what a great thing we are doing in social policy. They did not do that. I have a story about my grandfather, in Richmond in this case, but it would apply to Vanport just as well. There were some Caucasian mothers who were complaining about the daycare center in Richmond, which was integrated. And they were saying that Henry J. really should build a separate daycare center. And I'm told that Henry J. just laughed at them and said, ladies, I have built you a daycare center. It is integrated. You may use it if you wish to. And that was the end of that. So I didn't know him too well personally. Henry J. was a presence in my life as almost a mythical figure. When he came to visit my parents' home, it wasn't granddad's coming to visit and let's have a barbecue. It was almost a state occasion. And there was a sense, even for a young person who maybe wasn't totally aware what was it all about, that this was a great man, larger than life. And I saw him through that lens rather than somebody who told me stories and who, was the warm and fuzzy character who took me fishing. It just wasn't that way. At the time, Vanport wasn't a social experiment. It was an absolute necessity to find a way to bring workers into the shipyards. That simple. Along with doing that, there was some attention to making the place livable. And that was an outgrowth of the experiences Kaiser learned on construction projects where you had to build whole cities in remote areas. You had to do more than the bare minimum or you weren't going to get the workers. So there was that heritage, but that wasn't a subject which was talked about nostalgically in the family or around the dining room table ever. I really knew nothing about Vanport until I moved to Portland in 2013. I began talking to quite a few people who had Vanport experiences through different kinds of lenses. I continue to have an interest in the fact that that time was very formative in Portland's culture, Portland's history, and it's a good thing for cities to take an interest in their history and how the community is involved in it. And so I expect there will be a continuation of that kind of involvement. I don't know where it will lead, but I'll be supportive of it when and where I can.
Why don't you see the big Skanner, he shall find. Knock, knock, can the door tell me go let's baby, let it tell me go. For when the love comes twinkling down, why don't you see the big Skanner, he shall find. Knock, knock, can the door tell me open. Let the baby, let it tell me go. For when the love comes twinkling down, while I have been there, while I have been there, while I have been there, when the love comes twinkling down, why don't you see? Seek, seek, and ye shall find. Knock, knock, and the door shall be open. At the favor, and it shall be go, and when the love comes twinkling down.
After that, because of the redlining that occurred, where again, pretty much Portland said, we're going to make sure that blacks remain separated from the larger community. I wonder what that decision, how that impacted race relations with blacks feeling like they could or were a part of the larger Portland community, being relegated to certain places. And now, I left. I went to the service. I'm an Air Force veteran, served honorably, the wonderful experience, came back, went to college, left here, went to grad school almost 30 years ago, came back about 5 years ago, and it's been interesting to see how this generational cycle has occurred in Portland, where it seems like Portland now is very much kind of almost like a Vanport experience without the flood.
Yes, yes.
Okay, meaning that whites essentially have just come in and taken over and displaced those African Americans that were in Vanport, and essentially gentrified the area, moved all the black folks out to what they call now the numbers. I'd never heard of the numbers.
Yes.
Anybody else ever heard of the numbers in here? The numbers, which is areas past like 160 seconds or something like that, where now all pretty much so many of the black people, that's where they were, relegated to live because that's what they could afford. I grew up on Williamson, Alberta, in the heart of it. I went to Humboldt Elementary School. I remember the day, and Mr. Foster, you know this, when I was growing up, I think I probably look a lot older than I am, but I will say this. I remember when we had a black mailman. I remember when we had a black doctor. I remember when all of our businesses in the community were black-owned. Portland used to be, the black community used to be thriving. Dr. O.B. Williams, Vancouver Avenue. You said Maranatha. I remember Pastor Garlington, everything that he did back in the day. But Pastor O.B. Williams, Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church. A lot of folks from Vanport ended up going to Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church. Our churches, our community. Now all of that pretty much is gone. The churches are still here, but a lot of black people can't even get back to the churches because they live so far out now. You have a Vancouver Avenue, you've got a New Hope, you got a Maranatha. So it's like, it just came to me when I said the Vanport without the flood, but that's what it's been like now. So there was an intentional gentrification that moved out all the people that they didn't want to have here.
And I've been here almost pretty close to 50 years. And I came here because I thought it was a great opportunity. Nobody leaving Portland. They're coming. They're coming. And if you go in these universities, school, you see all kinds of people now. If you think about it, Portland on the West Coast was the only city that got one senator, a congressional seat, and that's at number 6. I think they're both voting for it now. California losing, Idaho I think losing, so they're coming to Portland, and it tells me that there's still a lot of things that are happening in Portland. Just there's a lot of work, but it's fun work, and if one doesn't do anything about it, it'll stay the same. So other folks are doing it. So my suggestion is to get involved and make an issue. It's not going to stay the same. It's not. It is going to change. So what we have to do is be a part of the change. I'm sorry. That's an editorial comment.
No, it's wonderful to hear all these voices today. And so my name's Tanya, and I did my dissertation work on Giles Lake courts. So I always feel like I did my dissertation on the stepchild. But I always have to go to anything about Vanport because I'm going to learn something about Giles Lake. Recently, I helped a reporter at Street Roots write about the Irvin Jones case, which was when police officer Bard Purcell shot Mr. Irvin Jones in front of his family. Those grandchildren and children did not know their own family history until Breonna Taylor. Then they said, that's what happened to your grandfather. There are living people who were in that house. And it was very hard to unpack that when a family reaches out and has a generational trauma and reaches out to me because I've been writing about that for school, right? So they reached out to Street Roots. It's a story I really want to get out there. The family wants that, I guess is the death certificate that says justifiable homicide. They want that changed. So I want to speak out about that. And I know that there were what was called riots, I would say demonstrations at Vanport. This is in 46, about what was happening at Giles Lake. Giles Lake was intentionally segregated. Vanport had some enclaves, some choice going on. There was not that. And I know Mr. Washington, it took a long time for him to talk about the 6 years he lived at Giles Lake because many people moved into Giles Lake after the flood. Giles Lake's built at the same time. But so that's why I'm here today, is because there's always those stories and those narratives. And oftentimes I get quoted in the newspaper and they go, oh, that other housing project. Because it's spelled guild, so the darn newspaper reporter can't figure out what I talked about. So like that woman who likes that other housing project. There was 10,000 people in that other housing project, half of whom were African American.
I have lived all over the country, Miami, Florida, New York City, Los Angeles, Seattle. I always come home to Portland because I love this place. These are the best of times and worst of times. Portland, Oregon is one of the most racist cities in the United States of America. And right now there are many descendants of the Ku Klux Klan who were very strong in this state. So those of us that believe in good and love and mercy and grace, we have work to do. I am here today because I know what I have to do from the spiritual community of this city. I was born and bred in the church I'm a member of 2 churches right now, Maranatha, my home church, but also Vancouver Avenue Baptist. I believe in God. Our only hope is spiritual today, in my estimations. Of course, if we're spiritual, we're also political. And all of us sitting here who made the effort to come and hear about Vanport, we have work to do because it starts with one person. And as we pass the baton of what we've learned today to those we come in contact with, we have to share the vision. I thank God for Bernie. I met Bernie when he first started the Skanner newspaper. I worked as a fashion editor, writer for him, and I know his mission and Bobby's mission and Jerry's mission. Thank God for media that tells the truth, because part of our problem today is the media who lies and edits inferiorly as far as a lot of stories are told, and our children deserve the truth. Vanport is about truth. Truth. So I'm here today, and I'm so glad I came. Thank you, Bernie, for showing this again, because I know what I have to do. I'm going to work on behalf of what I believe in. I believe in people. Black lives matter, yes. White lives matter, yes. Red and yellow, black and white matter. And this division that has started with our president that was so vile and started a race war in our country, we must do something to stand against this. So it's each one to pass the baton on to someone else.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're right, absolutely.
What happened to the yard for my grandbabies? What happened to the yard for family gatherings and picnics? I was born and raised in Portland. The reason I know about Vanport is because of my parents, my grandparents, my aunties, and those older people in my life told me. So I know about Vanport. But the other piece for me is that I believe in this city, but I also I'm not blind. So you can tell your stories, you can blow smoke, but I'm always going to kind of keep digging, because I know there's 2 sides to every story. And what that reality is, I look right now as I live in the community. I still live in North Portland. I own my own home, but I can walk in my neighborhood that I know used to be predominantly black, and I can walk down the street and everybody look at me like I'm an oddity. And the reality is they also want me to move out of their way. Not with just them as the people, but they got their dogs. And they not little dogs, they big dogs. And they kind of like, they not pulling them back. So for me, it's really a matter of how do you help people to understand? It's great you want to do all these projects, but these projects are the things that continue to muck up our communities, because it's not equitable. What you're giving me is what you think I want versus what I actually need.
I really believe that a discussion, and this is going to really sound controversial to some, but I really do believe that a discussion about reparations needs to occur. And when I say reparations, I mean in a very real, tangible way in terms of impacting the lives of generations, particularly black people in Portland who have been impacted by so-called urban renewal, by Vanport, and by just completely, redline, all of that. A discussion about what that would mean and how could that actually be implemented by the city in terms of housing, in terms of education, for generations of kids. How would something like that make it to discussions to really have an impact for folks?
I learned about Vanport and Oregon history when I returned 20 years ago, moved back from the Bay Area, and there is a real good crew of people through Oregon Historical Society. Contact them, and they did a Vanport, they did Albina, they did all of the area that had been exited and redlined, and there are people out of Salem who organize these exhibits, a couple women who are African American out of Salem who do these exhibits. And they said, because I didn't know Duke Ellington came to Portland and performed a couple times. I didn't know some of these famous musicians came.
I heard it too. I didn't know either.
But get involved. They said, get involved local city politics, but that's going to be fighting with developers. So good luck. Move back from Vancouver.
It's a good comment. And I could listen to this all night. I do have my own views too. You probably saw some if you read the paper, but my views are similar to that. One of the things I think that need to take place is the fact that any politician has to have a vested interest. If they don't have that vested interest, then it's not to his or her behavior pattern. So we have to make it to his or her behavioral pattern. That is by not electing those that want your vote. So I think it's important for people to make it real clear. If you want my vote, this is what you got to do. If you don't want it, that's fine. But I won't vote you. Then vote for the one that's important to you. Go ahead, ma'am.
There's a lot of history about Portland, black Portland, that people don't know. The self-sufficiency that we had as a community. I remember as a little kid going to my auntie's house and my uncle's house. They lived on Blandina in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. My uncle worked as a porter on the railroad, and they had a boarding house upstairs that they built in their 2-story house for pier porters because there was no place for them to live outside of that. And so my thinking is, people, you don't know what you don't know, but if you don't know where you came from, you sure don't know where you're going to go.
I want everybody to just go around the room and just answer that question.
So, yes.
Just from left to right, and you come back. I just want that question answered. The question is, do anybody want?
I think a museum to the African American history in Portland, with a large part of it on Vanport, would be absolutely important to the city.
Okay.
I think that it has got an extremely rich culture here, the African American community. And so I commend you for making this film. I love the Skanner. I subscribe to the Skanner, and I thank you for what you do. But I think you need, again, more diverse kinds of information out to more communities.
I agree with you.
Certainly the notion of a museum, an accessible museum somewhere that draws attention to Vanport and its history deserves to exist someplace in the area, and people ought to know about it. I think if there's some way, you hear people now talking about making laws of what you can't teach kids in school, which is just mind-bogglingly insane. If there were a way of combining creation of such a museum with kind of general understanding that in the elementary schools and on the way up, there'll be a segment that has to do with what people force kids to think about what kind of country they think would be reasonable for all people and fair and accessible as a component of reminding people in this area how bad things have been. A museum would be a good component, and I know, having come myself from Texas here 50 years or so ago, a little more, I wouldn't have known of Vanport if it hadn't been that my child brides. It's been easier for me to learn about Vanport because of that than it ever would have been otherwise. I don't think if it hadn't been for things that I learned through her family and then through her continuing interest, I don't think I would have ever heard anything about Vanport. So I think it's an important contribution to local needs to understand. But again, it's part of dealing with the monstrous problem we have all across the country of people who care more about what their collection of money is than what constitutes a reasonable, rational, fair kind of life.
Thank you very much.
I'm Alan. I've been in the neighborhood since 2008. And I'm really interested in history of the neighborhood and Portland in general. And I think that it is a little bit hard to learn some of that stuff. So whether it's a specific museum to Vanport or whatever, I think just teaching the history however that happens is important. And so thankful that you put on this event. It's nice to put a face to those articles I've been reading.
Oh, good.
And
well, I don't write them all, okay?
But yeah, I guess, you know, it's interesting that to hear the gentrification that I'm a part of, or a participant in, often or almost always talked about as like a negative thing that's happening in the neighborhood. And I think that the displacement that came from it is really troubling to understand. Like, I mean, it's easy to understand, but it's troubling to think about. Obviously, it would be great if we could improve the city without displacing people. And I think that, 40 years people have been talking about that, and I haven't seen a lot of action and policy on that effect. So, that's kind of my vision for moving forward. We still got to keep building. We need housing for people living on the streets, but we don't need to push out the people that are already living here.
You guys did a great job.